The world stands with India. There might be skirmishes but no war. That's what External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj told Parliament today. But on Gravitas tonight, we ask, where is this support? Who is supporting India? 5 weeks since the standoff began, can you name one major world leader questioning China's brinkmanship? They suggest, in muted tones, that India and China resolve it mutually. A mature India says that National Security Advisor Ajit Doval will visit China next week as scheduled and that talks will diffuse this. But China clearly shows no inclination to inch towards a resolution and the world shows no will to hold it accountable. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. The headlines first. Pakistan is using America as a limitless ATM, says a congressional panel calling for tougher conditions for aid, hours after a State Department report called it a safe haven for terrorists. What's stopping the US from calling Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism then? North Korea is testing components to launch another intercontinental ballistic missile within the next 14 days, says US intelligence agencies. They have new imagery showing preparations for a test. Nawaz Sharif's children will spend 7 years in jail if they submitted forged documents in the Panama probe. The Pakistan Supreme Court warns, hearing the JIT report case for the 4th straight day today. Differences persist between European Union and the United Kingdom as round 2 of Brexit talks ends. The EU says the UK is not clear on citizen rights and the divorce bill. A massive drug bust in Berlin. Authorities seized 3.8 tons of cocaine wrapped in colorful packets worth more than $900 million. They say it came from Uruguay and Paraguay. And more than 1 lakh people infected, over 200 dead in Sri Lanka's worst ever dengue outbreak. The government imposes regulations under the Public Security Act, deploys soldiers and police to fight the epidemic. Also on Gravitas, we tell you all about India's new president. Who is Ramnath Kovind and what does he bring to the high office? Plus a very special interview with a man who is instrumental in shaping America's policy on Pakistan, influential Congressman Ted Poe. We are also taking you to Mosul tonight to see the human face of tragedy, what war does to women who suffer the consequences but almost never have a say. In neighboring Syria, Vladimir Putin may have registered a win. Donald Trump has forced the CIA to stop arming anti-Assad rebels. We'll talk about the consequences. But first, to what's happening along India's border with China. In 1989, Chinese troops mowed down thousands of protesters in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Just last week, Chinese Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo died of cancer in a Chinese prison. He was prevented from seeking treatment abroad. For years now, China has laid claims to territories belonging to other countries, be it in India, Japan or Taiwan. There is a massive build-up of troops and threatening noises of war. China's PLA on Bhutan's Doklam Plateau, which Bhutan had requested the Indian army to guard, has been threatening India. Western nations always cite democracy, freedom of expression and the protection of sovereign territory and human rights. They have railed against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, subsequent Iranian regimes, Turkey's President Erdogan, and yet, what is the world doing and saying about China's invasion of Doklam? Not a lot. We at WION are not surprised, and senior foreign editor Padma Rao explains why.
The US is the world's largest economy. China is the second largest. The US-China relationship is the century's most important, say analysts. Two-way trade between the countries stands at US dollars 578.6 billion. The US exports 115.8 billion to China, and the other way around, the figure stands at 462.8 billion. The United States on the Doklam invasion, it expressed concern. China is the EU's second largest trading partner. The EU exports to China a total of 314.4 billion euro. EU FDI into China stands at 7.1 billion. China exports to the European Union 308.4 billion euro. Chinese investment in the EU 0.7 billion. And what does the EU say on the Doklam invasion? That China's road builders were caught unawares. China is Nepal's top donor. Nepal policy is one of equidistance from India and China. China's FDI into Nepal, US dollars 3.48 billion, and it promises a further 13.52 billion. Nepal on the Doklam invasion, silence. With US dollars 15 billion, China is the largest investor in Sri Lanka. The island nation is part of China's maritime Silk Route. A sixth of Lanka's external debt is towards China. But what does Sri Lanka say on the Doklam invasion? Zilch. Pakistan and China. Need WION say anything? Padma Rao, WION.
China's frequent incursions along the 3,600-kilometer-long border to India are well known. But what are its issues with at least 18 other countries, even with those it shares no land boundaries with? Here's a report.
Walls don't hinder it, nor do fences, nor do the deepest oceans. Agreements are frequently disputed or reinterpreted with poetic freedom. Asian superpower China is facing off with both ethnically related neighbors and others. The dragon has been breathing fire and locking horns with at least 18 countries across Asia, including its other mighty Asian challengers, Japan and India. To Japan, Beijing says that the Senkaku Islands and sometimes the Ryukyu archipelago are China's sovereign territory. It cites the ancient Ming dynasty to demand parts of Vietnam and Cambodia. Historical events of the late 1800s come in handy when China wants parts of Nepal and Bhutan. Indeed, a convenient explanation for all Chinese claims in the former Himalayan kingdoms that they belong to Tibet. The Yuan dynasty springs to Beijing's mind when it turns its territorial gaze upon North Korea's Baekdu Mountain, and sometimes Beijing's radar lays claim on all of North Korea, Taiwan, but also significant tracts of Laos. And the fact that Brunei is one of the richest kingdoms in the world is no great impediment. Beijing believes and occupies several islands of the Spratly Atoll. Central Asia absorbs China's ambition too. It sees parts of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan as its own. Why the dispute? Blame it on Russia. As for Mongolia, all of which it sees as its own land. Well, lay it squarely on Genghis Khan. What's brewing on China's immediate western borders and beyond? Plenty. Afghanistan's Badakhshan is coveted by Beijing. China illegally occupies thousands of kilometers of Aksai Chin in India's state of Jammu and Kashmir. To the naked Chinese eye, Arunachal Pradesh is the southern part of Tibet. That the Arunachalis insist they are Indian is hardly important. Finally, China squats on more than 5,000 kilometers of Indian territory in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And what about Pakistan? Few surprises that it is one of the few South Asian countries upon which China lays no territorial claims. After all, it pays to be a paid protectorate of the mighty People's Republic of China. Bureau Report, WION.
And joining us this evening on Gravitas, Ainar Thangan, political and economic commentator, someone who also advises the Chinese government on economic development issues, joining us from Beijing, a regular guest here on Gravitas. Good evening, Ainar. Good to have you on the show. We also have with us from Coimbatore, Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, PVSM, AVSM, VSM, Madras Regiment officer, someone who's also served in the Doklam area and understands this region very well. Thank you for being with us on Gravitas. We'll be joined by Yuvraj Ghimire, journalist, editor-in-chief at the Annapurna Post Daily. He also writes for the Reporter Weekly and the Indian Express with us from Kathmandu. Good evening to all of you. General Narasimhan, does the West's silence on this surprise you? In the event of a conflict, do you believe that India is going to be standing alone?
To some extent, yes, I would say that. Politically, probably we may get some kind of a support from some of our allies. But by and large, we should be able to look after ourselves and go it alone.
Let me dwell on this a little further, General Narasimhan. The points that I raised earlier in our report also raised that the West loses no opportunity to lecture others on human rights violations, on brinkmanship, on what's happening in the world. Only yesterday we were reporting how America was telling Venezuela it's a badly run country and so it needs regime change. But on this issue, when two Asian giants have been engaged in this conflict for almost 5 weeks now, silence.
In fact, even we would like to keep it bilateral, because we have been saying all along that the India-China issues and the India-Pakistan issues are going to be bilateral and discussed bilaterally. And that is the way probably we would like to have it. So whether the Western countries give some kind of a support by statements or otherwise, I am sure at the governmental level there are a number of interactions that are going on. We actually don't know, it's not in the public domain. We don't know actually what is happening in that particular front. But by and large, we have maintained that India-Pakistan, India-China relations are going to be bilateral.
Right. Einar, the Chinese press says that the West is using India to counter China. India says that the West's hypocrisy is exposed here because China is not being held accountable. How do you think the world sees this confrontation in Doklam?
Well, the recent article in Newsweek made it very clear that they saw that Indian troops crossed a border into a disputed area between Bhutan and China on the 16th. Formal diplomatic protests were only forthcoming 12 days later, on the 30th. So for a lot of people, they're scratching their head, why did not India first, or Bhutan first, lodge diplomatic concerns before taking unilateral action? This is a situation which they would find very difficult to support.
Yuvraj Gibere is also with us. Yuvraj, what about India's neighbors? There's a sense in New Delhi that while India may be fighting Bhutan's war, there's a studied silence on the part of Bhutan. How do neighbors like Nepal and Bhutan see this conflict?
Well, like Bhutan's and Nepal's case in this, in this context are different. My own understanding is neither India nor China have briefed Nepal about the situation that is building up there. And so Nepal hasn't taken any position. Also, I believe that there has been the tradition as far as Nepal is concerned. In 1962 conflict, Nepal maintained a neutral stance there. Although war affects, if this tension escalates into a war affects all. They are clear about it. But at the moment, I think, their policy has been to maintain silence.
That's convenient, I'd say. General Narasimhan, what about Bhutan's silence? How do you see that?
Bhutan has actually not been silent. If you remember that, if you recollect, that Bhutan also requested China to stay away from that area, and one of their patrols had gone to inform this particular issue. However, since the Chinese troops did not go back, then India had to intervene into this. As you are aware, in 2012, there was an understanding between India and China to say that any of the areas which are actually bordering the tri-junction areas will no action will be taken to change the status quo, and all decisions on those areas will be taken with the consent of all the three parties. So that particular status quo, this time, China seems to have challenged it. And that is one of the reasons why this standoff has taken place.
Einar, do you want to respond?
Yes, the location of the tri-junction from the Indian point of view and the Chinese point of view do not agree. And I think that is part of the problem. You're talking about two countries that do not have natural historical borders, but were subject to the Dada-esque ideas of Englishmen who were trying to redraw things for their own purposes, mostly mercantile, 100, 200 years, 150 years ago. So it's not something that has been encountered before. These border disputes are not very, very clear. But what is clear is that Bhutan did not lodge a formal complaint to China until the 29th, 11 days after, 13 days after the incursion by Indian troops. So it's still very, very puzzling, both to Beijing and to the rest of the world, why India sent unilaterally, before lodging protests, troops into an area that is disputed. There are all sorts of disputes between these countries. It seems that India has sided with the U.S., and at this point, it seems the U.S. doesn't seem to care too much about India. Maybe that's something that Jay Shankar should be considering as he goes forward.
Well, this is confusing, admittedly, and this is something that I've been discussing for weeks now on this show. And we keep going back and forth, General Narasimhan, on who did what and who did what wrong, and did India act unilaterally?
Basic thing is, first action was taken by the Chinese troops on ground by trying to alter the status quo. And that is the reason why India had to react in the manner in which she did. And the blame game may be going on. Chinese may be saying that the Indian troops violated the boundary, and Indian troops may be saying that Chinese troops violated the boundary. The fact of the matter remains that this issue needs to be resolved diplomatically, and the all efforts should be made to de-escalate the situation from both the sides.
Of which there are no signals from the other side, it seems. But Yuvraj Ghimire, as foreign policy experts, as defense experts, weigh in on what's happening, what are the implications and the read between the lines. For a layperson, help us understand, what does Doklam really mean for Bhutan? Does it have strategic significance? What does it mean for China? Why does China care so much to build a road in that region and go into Bhutan? What is happening for someone who doesn't really understand this region very well?
Well, you know, like this would be very, very difficult for me to answer from Nepal. You know, like the question here is why. Why does China want to build a road? Because China claims it belongs to, you know, like their territory, and so does Bhutan. That's a conflict area. So here, more than building or not building a road, this requires a resolution diplomatically, as General Narasimhan said. And so the other issue is, you know, like there was a reference about 2012 understanding that any dispute in area in tri-junction should be settled amicably, you know, involving all the three sides. But unfortunately, there has been a violation of this spirit by India and China in 2015, when the two countries decided to develop, you know, Lipulek along the Kalapani sector as trade zone, where there is Nepal's stake as well. So Nepal has lost the protest. So what I'm saying is tri-junction areas along the tri-junction areas always are conflict. I mean, they have conflict potential, and they should be sensitively handled. And we only hope, like Nepal can only hope and wish that this doesn't escalate into a full-blown, you know, like tension war, and it is resolved diplomatically before it gets to that stage.
Ainar Thangan, the Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of External Affairs in India today said that NSA Ajit Doval will be travelling to China as scheduled, and that this can be resolved diplomatically. That's the line that the Indian government has taken from day one. Is there an inclination in China to walk halfway?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, they're more than willing to walk halfway as long as Indian troops are not on what they perceive to be their territory. This is the sticking point. You know, if the situation were reversed, I ask you, and Chinese troops say they were doing something on behalf of Pakistan and they entered into Indian territory, all right, how would that be treated? Would India demand that Chinese troops leave Indian territory, disputed territory, before any such negotiations would take place? I think the answer is yes. So this is one of the reasons that India finds itself increasingly isolated on this particular matter. People are still scratching their heads. You know, our military friend has said that, you know, the Indian troops acted the quote way they did. He forgot to mention that supposedly Nepal had asked them to do that. The truth is, Nepal wasn't aware of it until India told them that this was going on, and they have remained silent. I think it's very clear all the international pointers show that this is not something where India has a lot of international sympathy. And this should be cause to reflect and think about what the next step should be.
I'm not sure China has much international sympathy either, but that point is moot because none is looking for it, it seems. General Narasimhan, the Ministry of External Affairs today said that if China unilaterally changes status quo of the tri-junction point between China, India and Bhutan, then it poses a challenge to our security. What is the way forward in the event of talks not resolving this?
I don't see that the talks will not get resolved. Maybe it will take some time, but the standoff may be a little prolonged. There has been past instances in Sumdrungchu incident of 1986-87. So something similar would probably work out, and the standoff may be a little longer, but I am sure ultimately the diplomatic skills will come into play. But as far as the China not interfering or interfering in Indian territory is, they have a long history of that. 1963, there was an agreement between India and China and Pakistan to Pakistan hand over Shashkam Valley to China. And similarly, the Karakoram Highway, which went through the Gilgit-Baltistan area, all those things have been happening earlier also by the Chinese. So to say unilaterally that only India has done this is not correct. However, I maintain that the situation will probably stabilize over a period of time. After a little prolonged standoff, maybe the diplomatic issues will come into play.
Right, the government of India maintaining that there is no unusual activity along the India-China border, and this is just another instance of China playing mind games. I'm going to thank you all, Ainar Thangan, Yuvraj Ghimire and retired Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan. Appreciate you joining us and sharing your points of view. In fact, another instance of America's silence is this. Senior Congressman Ted Poe talked to WION about a whole lot of issues but evaded questions on China. Listen into his conversation with senior editor Surya Gangadharan.
I'd like to welcome Mr. Ted Poe. He's a Republican congressman in Washington, D.C., and he's been pushing forward a bill that would sanction Pakistan, perhaps even deprive it of some of its valued status as an ally of the U.S. Mr. Poe, we've seen these efforts before, these legislative efforts, whether on the part of Democrat administrations or even Republican. How different is it going to be this time around?
Well, there's two different issues. In the defense reauthorization bill, we cut aid to Pakistan, and in that legislation, not completely, but we cut aid. That was just an amendment to the bigger bill. My legislation is independent and separate from that defense reauthorization bill, and my bill does two things. It labels Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, and then a second bill determines that they should be removed from the non-NATO ally status.
And how long could this legislative process that you have initiated, how long could it take?
Well, we have the bill. We filed the bill. It's now in committee, and so it moves through the process. I do not know when this will actually happen, but we have to start with the legislation, and so we have filed the legislation. We're getting other members of Congress to support the legislation, and this is the best opportunity we've had in years to get this legislation passed, because most members, I should say, many members of Congress understand that Pakistan is not a loyal ally. They play both sides, and they hide terrorists in their own country. The State Department even said yesterday that Pakistan is a safe haven for terrorists. So we will just continue to press the issue. It is not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen, I think, eventually.
What explains the U.S. linkage with Pakistan? I know it goes back many, many decades, but the continuing relationship has run into a lot of problems over the years. What explains the U.S. Commitment to this relationship?
I understand, and it's been doesn't give me any comfort either, because I've been working on this issue for years, trying to get the United States to understand that Pakistan is not a faithful ally, as we say. And we should pivot to India. It's a long process. I think the new administration is the closest we've had in years that will maybe take this position and work closer with India and try to cut the ties to Pakistan. I'm talking about the ties giving money to Pakistan. That's the key. We give American money to Pakistan. It's used against Americans in Afghanistan, in my opinion. And I think that's the key to cut that money, cut the military aid. It's going to be, I think, a long process.
Given the fact that the Pakistan relationship is so old with the US, do you expect resistance from some of the intelligence agencies like perhaps the CIA or the FBI that deal with Pakistan on a regular basis?
Well, that's a very good comment, because that is part of the resistance, is because the intelligence agencies, the U.S. military, those that want to, in Homeland Security, that's been the resistance. And those are the members of Congress, plus those agencies that we have to convince it's time to cut back aid to Pakistan. If we can't convince them to do it, we have to pass legislation and force them to do it.
Mr. Poe, thank you. Thank you very much for those answers.